I'm Alex Joseph. I'm the managing editor of Hue magazine at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Welcome to another installment of FIT Talks, the oral history program of FIT. Today is August 30, 2017. It's 11 a.m. and I'm interviewing Peter Scotese, the Chairman Emeritus of FIT's Board of Trustees. Thank you so much, Pete, for taking time to talk with me today.
You're welcome.
So, for context, could you tell me a little bit about your childhood?
About?
Your childhood, where you grew up and...
Yeah, well, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. My mother was a second-generation immigrant, and she married a first-generation Italian immigrant who was a barber and who died shortly after I was born, so I didn't get to know my father. And this was in 1920, and the Great Depression was in process. And my mother really couldn't afford to keep all four children. I had a brother and two sisters and myself. So she, in those days, a fatherless boy was an orphan because women didn't work. The women stayed home, took care of the family, and the men did the work. So I went to a school that was founded by a Frenchman named Stephen Girard, and it was for poor male white orphans. The speculation is that the reason he didn't include non-whites is that there weren't any non-white orphans, they were slaves, and they were taken care of. And that became an issue in the 1960s when Martin Luther King marched around the school I went to and wanted them to open up to minorities, which I was hardly in favor of as a graduate, and which they did. And then subsequently, a few years later, they opened up so women could attend. So in the 60s, it really became open for boys and girls. And today, it's about 50-50, female, male. So I was enrolled in Girard College at age 8. It's on a 45-acre campus in the heart of Philadelphia. Still exists. I've been proactive with them for the last 15 to 20 years. They ran into some problems, still have some, but they're resolving them. And as I think I mentioned to you earlier, it was kind of a military style of environment. Every hour of every day was accounted for, and everybody participated in everything, whether it was sports or study or whatever. We were programmed from the time we got up in the morning at 6 o'clock. 6:15 you brushed your teeth, cleaned up. 6:30 marched over to have breakfast. At 7 o'clock you showed up at the auditorium for services. At 7:30 you went to, or 7:45 you went to study hall. And you had classes all day long, which, interestingly enough, we had the liberal arts, and we had shop, we had mechanical school, which included foundry, machine shop, electrical shop, tin shop, carpentry. We also had commercial subjects, shorthand, typing, bookkeeping. And then we had all the liberal arts, 5 years of languages, and recreation spotted throughout the day into the early evening. We had study halls, and in addition, either you belonged to the battalion of cadets, which I belonged to, glee club, orchestra, but you were kept busy from the time you got up in the morning till the time you went to bed at night. 9 years of that. So that's why I felt very structured and disciplined, self-disciplined, and I think maybe that's what I learned most from Gerard was self-discipline. And so that was from 19, I entered Gerard in 28 and got out in 1937.
Wow.
When you left Gerard, they gave you a trunk. And in the trunk was a couple of suits, pair of shoes, shorts, underwear, 3 books, a song book, biography of Stephen Gerard, and the Bible. It was the King James Version of the Bible. Interestingly, in the will of Stephen Gerard, no clergy of any denomination was permitted to enter the grounds, because in his words, in the will, he did not want the tender minds of the orphans to be influenced as to what religion they should belong to until they were mature enough to make their own decision. But having said that, we had chapel every day. And it was non-sectarian, based on the King James Version of the Bible. And we had 6 out of 7 days we had chapel services. We were allowed out on weekends, overnight, so we did see our parent, in this case my mother. So I'd say that there was a lot of redundancy to every day, and I guess the major incident that happened to me was I got in a fair amount of trouble in the early stages of high school. I went over the wall and escaped Gerard for a week, then gave myself in because there was an epidemic of polio in the city, and we would the kids went over with me, would steal bread from in front of a store when it was dropped off in the morning, but we got tired of that menu and finally decided we'd like to get back home. So we hailed a police car and went back, and the superintendent there says, George said, well, why'd you come back? I said, well, we're hungry. He said, well, I got news for you. You're going to be quarantined for another 2 days because we want to be sure you don't have any polio if you brought back to the jar. Anyway, that precipitated Gerard deciding to let me go. And my mother came in and pleaded with him and salvaged me for another shot at staying on, which happened, and I reformed. And took the rest of my 3 years pretty seriously. I was on the honor roll, captain of the gym team, leading role in the French play and all this kind of stuff. Captain of my company, which won the close order drill, and that sword behind you was just sent to me after 80 years. That's what I won. And I'd say that closes the chapter of my life from age 8 to 17. It was very difficult to get a job, but I was fortunate in getting a job as a male secretary to the vice president and treasurer of a real estate company in Philadelphia called Albert M. Greenfield Company. They were big in real estate and insurance. And I was secretary to the vice president and treasurer, a fellow named Robert M. Wilson, who was married but childless, and he took an interest in me and suggested I go to the Wharton School. It was then called the Wharton Evening School of Accounts and Finance at the University of Pennsylvania. And my grandmother had left $1,200 in trust for me when I was 21. We were able to attack that to pay the tuition, which was, by the way, was $40 per semester.
Wow.
Interestingly. So went to Wharton 2 nights a week for 2 years and 3 nights a week for 3 years. Got a certificate. I joined a fraternity there, was pretty proactive in other ways in order to supplement my income, which was, by the way, the grand sum of $16 a week for 5.5 days of work. I kept the books for Jack State's Inn. It was on the campus at the University of Pennsylvania, and Cassano's Cafe, and a diner. Oh. And I earned as much money doing that as I did at Albert M. Greenfield and Company. So that supplemented my income, and then I was proactive with the fraternity. So between my job, my schooling, the fraternity, and then courting my future wife, who I had met at the Newman Club at the University of Pennsylvania, I was a pretty busy guy.
Wow.
And we were driving around in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia in December of 41, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And I turned to my bride-to-be and said, our lives will never be the same. That was December, married in January, and I volunteered as an officer candidate in November and was assigned to Fort Benning and trained in the infantry. No, I'm sorry, I was trained in anti-aircraft artillery. And became a lieutenant in anti-aircraft artillery. Was shipped up to Fort Edwards, Massachusetts, and we trained up there in a what they called a self-propelled battery, which consisted of 4, each half-track, which were part wheels, part half-track, part tank, had a gun turret with 4 50 caliber machine guns calibrated, and with the sights, and we would be shooting at targets, planes actually. Oh. And because the trajectory of the bullets in the planes their planes were moving, you had to learn to shoot well in advance of the plane's flight path, so that they would fly into the bullets. And after 6 or 7 months there, I was involuntarily transferred to the infantry because they had 2,500 excess second lieutenants in anti-aircraft artillery. Wow. So I took a 17-week officer special basic training course in infantry, which was the worst 17 weeks of my life. Oh no. Get you up at 3 in the morning, you'd march for 17 miles, sleep for 2 hours, go on again. At any rate, in order to get out of the infantry, I volunteered for the parachute infantry. Good. Then I was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for training in parachute jumping. And that was a 4-week course. And when that was over, I volunteered for what they called jump master training, A jump master was responsible for getting all of the parachutists out of the plane as quickly as possible. And if they hesitated in the door, you put your foot in their back and kick them out.
Boy.
So after that training, I was shipped by a ship called the Aquitania, which was the sister ship of the Lusitania, from Baltimore to Greenwich, Scotland, and then by landing boat to France. An interesting sidebar is that we were overnight in a town in France preparing to board trains that would take us to the combat zone, and we're allowed out overnight. And two of the troopers came back. They'd been drinking some French, it wasn't a wine, it was some kind of a cordial that had been poisoned by the locals, because the French were bitter at the fact that the Allied armies had leveled the town.
Oh, wow. Sure.
In preparation for the landing. The citizens had been forewarned it was going to happen, but nevertheless,
Wow.
that was interesting because we thought we were there to protect the French, but there was a bitterness about what was going on. And there was, by the way, Frenchmen who were pro-German.
Right, sure, of course.
At any rate, we were shipped to an area called Chalon-sur-Marne in France, and made 2 parachute jumps, one in France that would mimic the invasion of Germany jump that we made in March of '45, which was the first invasion of Germany. I was assigned to the 17th Airborne Division. We cooperated with the British 6th Airborne and had an operation called Operation Varsity, which was the largest airborne operation in World War II, and the costliest in terms of men and material. And I was wounded twice, and once in the plane by anti-aircraft fire, and then 10 days later trying to wipe out a sniper's nest. They used to call me the jumping jack because I would jump out of the foxhole to attract sniper fire so they could locate the sniper.
Wow.
So I wound up in the 76th General Hospital in Liège, Belgium. Went back to my outfit in Oberhausen, Germany. And there was one interlude between then and the time we were re-equipped to fight the war in Japan. And that was when I decided to take a Dutch interpreter back to his home in Holland and learned that the Germans were still in Holland and had not surrendered. The Dutch and Holland had been occupied for 6 years. And along the way into Holland, I ran into a Hans von Zwei, who was a doctor, and the interpreter, who wanted to go back to see his family, and Hans, who wanted to see his family. They had been occupied for 6 years. Picked up some American flyers that had been shot down and hidden by the Dutch underground. And we were asked if we would help rescue the Dutch underground leader.
Right.
That he was going to be executed 2 days later. There's some pictures on the wall behind you of that moment in time. So I didn't know any better, and I was a little bit adventuresome. So I said, yeah, we'd help them. Now, bear in mind, I was in a chaplain's jeep with a white cross on it. I was wearing a leather jacket that I had confiscated from a dead glider pilot, and a shoulder holster. And we drew up in front of the German prison and demanded the release of Pete, the underground leader, and got away with it.
Wow.
They released him, put him in the Jeep, and about 10 minutes later we heard the sirens going. And my companion said to me, the Dutchman, "They're on to us. Better get out of here." I said, "Where am I going to hide?" He said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of you." So I was hidden out for 10 days until the Canadian Army came up to take the surrender officially. But that was a little incident that I dismissed until 45 years later. They were writing the history of Holland, and they kept seeing this Jeep, pictures of the Jeep all over the place, and they took them 40 years to track me down.
Oh my God.
And the internet finally tracked me down. And I was invited over there to receive some honors in 2005, honored by the city of Rotterdam. Well, anyway, we were re-equipped to go to Japan, and we took a boat out of Marseille, and we're headed for the Panama Canal when Truman dropped the bomb.
Right.
And that ended the war for me. We put into Newport News, Virginia, and had a month or two of duty and was shipped home. So that's that segment. Segment number 2 of my life.
That's amazing. When you were at Wharton, did you, sorry to go back to this, but did you think at that time that you would go into the textile industry and work in?
No.
No, okay.
No, as a matter of fact, when I came, it's a good question, because when I came out of, when I came back from the war and went to work for Albert M. Greenfield and Company, and again, an interesting sidebar, your employer was required to give you the same job plus any promotion you might have gotten while you were in the war. So when I came back from the war, I went back to Albert M. Greenfield and Company at $65 a week from 16. And while I was working there, I think the war had stimulated me. I decided I didn't want to be an accountant, sit around behind a desk. I wanted to be in the marketing, sales. And so I applied for there was an ad in the newspaper. I was sitting eating dinner with Millie, and the ad went something like this: wanted sales trainee, long hours, hard work, no car, low compensation. If you're successful, you might get a little bit rich. If you're not, we'll fire you. And so I decided to interview for it. And believe it or not, there was competition for that job then.
Well, it sounds like an adventure.
And that's what I did. And that started me in textiles. I was a sales trainee, salesman, regional salesman, general sales manager, and vice president over the next 17 years, selling over-the-counter piece goods for home sewing. And that I would call that phase 3 of my life. There we moved from Philadelphia to New York to Princeton,
right,
New Jersey for, let's see, that was 1950. I was in Princeton from 50 to 1963 working for the company selling over-the-counter piece goods when I was invited to interview for a job as chairman of the board of the Boston store in Milwaukee, which was a department store owned by Federated Department Stores.
What was the company that you worked for that sold piece goods?
Indian Head.
Indian Head. Right.
Indian Head Mill.
Right.
It was called Indian. It was the Indian Head division of Textron. Then we spun off from Textron and became Indian Head Inc. And that's the one that I'd been working for. Then that, I was invited to go to, I didn't know anything about running a department store, but they apparently thought that I had enough accounting background to know that they wanted a good return on investment and I might help them. And that became actually a very interesting 6 years of my life, probably the most interesting. Because not knowing anything about department stores, I decided that we would take this struggling department store, which was dominated by the then Gimbels of Milwaukee, who had just bought a competitor called Schuster's. And the head of that store took a liking to me, and he said, you don't seem to know anything about retailing, so maybe, why don't you come over someday and we'll talk about it? And we did. And he said, I want you to know that your market up here, the customers up here, buy corsets and candy. They're the two big items. I pondered that for about 5 months and decided to have a survey made of all the department stores in a 30-mile radius. J.C. Penney and Gimbels and Schuster's, and find out what kind of price lines and goods they were selling. And the results came back predominantly basement and budget price lines. And that's what we were selling. And I said, the reason they're buying, to myself, I said, the reason they're buying corsets and candy is we're not offering them anything above that. So I immediately decided to dump basement budget price lines and put moderate, upper moderate, and high-end goods in. And then to enliven the whole situation, I had an Italian import fair, and we brought in $1 million worth of Italian goods at retail from Florence and Rome and whatever. And at that time, the Metropolitan Museum had brought over Michelangelo's Pietà, the original.
Wow.
And I learned that there was a bronze reproduction of it in Florence. So I flew to Florence and bought this sculpture of the Pietà for I think I paid $8,000 for it, which wasn't a lot. It was a lot then. And when they announced that they had their Pietà, I took a full page out and said, and the Boston store has the only bronze reproduction in the world. We put a grotto in the store, and then we had a big fake sculpture of the home of David, $1 million worth of Italian goods. And that one promotion kind of catapulted the store to preeminence in better goods. And we kept it as an exciting place to be. We had the Florentine Opera perform. We built the first enclosed mall shopping center in the state of Wisconsin. And we promoted a week, which is still going, it's now 2 weeks, of Summerfest, in which all of the local businesses would support the arts in their own way. We brought in the folklorica from Mexico. We brought, my store sponsored an oompa band from Luchow's here in New York. And all businesses decided, their own way. And we also had we had a little beer garden where you could buy beer and bratwurst. And so we had a week of those kind of festivities. So the store got preeminence. And it was an exciting 5 or 6 years, and our sales and profits shot up. And I was very, very active within the community. I was co-chair of the Milwaukee Voluntary Equal Employment Opportunity Council, and I was co-chair of the Summerfest. And as a matter of fact, I got very involved with the Father Grappi, who was an Italian priest, supporting a group of African Americans, blacks, from inner city, called the Commandos, who were militant, and they marched in my stores with signs that said it's going to be a black Christmas.
Oh.
It's not going to be a white Christmas. So I said, I'd like to meet with you guys. There were 21 of them. And they were dressed in army uniform. One was a general and the other.
Wow.
So we meet as we're meeting right here. And I said, let me hear your gripes, because I'm interested in hearing. I don't know what I can do about them, but I'll try. So I found out who the head honcho was, and he spoke up and he said, well, for one thing, we can't get work around here. And I said, why? He said, because the application wants to know if you've been in prison before. And he said, I can tell you everybody in the inner city has been in prison at one time or another, but we went to jail, we paid our dues, came back. Why are we? So I was able to get the employers in Milwaukee to eliminate that question from the interview process for blacks or minorities. And I also said to I called him the head honcho, you're in charge. I'm going to hire all of you for the Christmas season. You're going to have an office next to mine. You're going to hire them. You're going to make sure they appear on time, that they don't steal, that they service people properly. Anybody comes to complain, a customer or a fellow employee comes to complain about, I'm going to put it right back to you. You're the boss. And we didn't have an iota of problem.
Wow.
One of them got promoted actually to I think it was the first time a African American had been promoted to a buyer. He became a buyer menswear.
Wow.
So that was kind of fun.
That's great.
So anyway, shall you
Can we take a quick pause?
quit for a while?
No, just for a second.
Yeah, I just need to change the camera
Yeah.
battery. It'll just take a moment. I'm sorry about that. So just a couple of minutes.
This is great.
Yeah. So, I didn't know any of this about the war. I mean,
I
that's
know,
such a great
it's fascinating.
story.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the war was transforming.
Of course.
Oh, by the way, I have some books. I'll probably give one. The history of the occupation of Holland was written up. And there were 2 books that were published on it. And I'm on the cover of the Jeep.
Oh,
and
nice. Yeah.
Yeah, so
That's
I'm on the
great.
cover of it. I have that.
maybe we could start talking about how you came to New York. You came to New York.
Yeah, I came to New York from, I was attracted again by a headhunter who came to visit me in Milwaukee and wanted to know if I would consider being interviewed for the job of running one of the largest textile mills in the country, Springs Industries.
Right.
They had 18 plants and 22,000 employees. And I would be the first non-family member. So they wanted to be very careful about who they chose. And I didn't really want to leave Milwaukee. I was enjoying it thoroughly, but it was a chance to come back east and to run a corporation instead of a division. And so I accepted reluctantly, and it was the headquarters were in Fort Mill, South Carolina, and the plants were all in South Carolina.
Right.
And I was a Yankee among 18,000. She knows. So I was amazed that they would even consider me. I was Catholic, and I think there were somebody came up to me and said, "Are you Catholic?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That's 6 of us."
Oh, wow.
out of 20,000.
Oh, wow.
And I was Italian.
Oh, my God.
And there were no Italians. So it was a kind of an act of faith on their part, I guess.
So, right?
But I was impressed by the fact that the family disregarded all of that. They were looking for somebody that could help the son-in-law who kind of driven the business the wrong way. And I had a 5-year contract with Federated, and they bought me out of that contract. But I remember the day when the recruiting firm decided that I was the candidate. They said, if you'll meet me out at the airport, we have a 5-year contract for you. And I said, I can't come. They said, why? I said, there's a Green Bay Packer game on. We're Packer fans, but if you want to come here, watch the game with me, I'd be glad to do it. Otherwise, we'll do it at some other time.
Oh.
So they came and watched the game.
They did. Oh, good.
So we got very close to the Packers, had them in our stores selling sporting goods. These were some of the other things we did. Got to know Lombardi, the coach, and so it was they were halcyon days, I'd say, in Milwaukee. Springs was a totally different thing in that it was a huge challenge to turn around and reinvent the culture of a company. And
at that time, was the textile industry was starting to become more international, correct? Is that
yes,
right?
we were, in those days, we were buying goods from low-cost producers. We were buying the kind of goods that did not require a high labor content. We sold, for instance, shirting fabrics to manufacturers. The ones who got now there's a high cost of labor in making a shirt then. There's too many things you have to do. Not just cutting the pattern, but sleeves and cuffs and buttons and whatever. And that started to migrate to low labor cost countries. In those days, Japan, Hong Kong, Portugal, Mexico, Brazil, China. And then as time went on, some of the countries I just described, wages started to go up, and China became an ideal place to produce goods that had high labor content. Eventually, I had predicted this in the 70s, I'd gone over to China, and I predicted that eventually a lot of our textile industry would move to China. 25 years later, 90% of it had left the country.
Yeah.
But I had a great time running the country. They were wonderful. I'm running the company. The people who owned it, the family owned it, were very eleemosynary. They built golf courses. They built facilities on Myrtle Beach so that the entry-level employees could go down. They could use the golf courses for $5 a month. They could go to Myrtle Beach and stay overnight for a couple of dollars a night. There were recreational facilities for older people. So they were very paternalistic is the way to put it. I cut out a lot of the other things they were doing, like they were leasing companies property, homes. They had an electric utility that was supplying electricity to the homes. They had company stores, and I felt it was getting they were getting too beholden. There were more. I felt it was treacherous to have people beholding everything they did was Springs. If they went to the hospitals, it was Springs. So it was too paternalistic. And I was referring to Hershey School, where it got unionized, but they were the same way. They provided homes, everything else up in Hershey, Pennsylvania and finally got unionized. And I think the guy who founded the Hershey Company and Hershey Chocolate, I don't know if he committed suicide or died or whatever. He was so distressed that having done all these things that they would turn against him. Oh. I didn't want to get unionized, and we did not get unionized. Mm-hmm. And the reason we didn't was some of the things we did I thought were very good, where we had community activities available, but not just for our employees, but for everybody in the community in which we had the plants. And that seemed to work pretty well for us, but we were careful not to have the employees feel beholden.
Right.
As a matter of fact, we had a profit-sharing pension plan that encompassed all the employees, where 15% of the pre-tax profits went into a fund for their pensions. And when they left, with Social Security and those pensions, they were pretty well taken care of. But we took care of the entry level, not what they do today, where they give the guy at the top a couple $100 million and the people at the bottom are forgotten. We managed from the bottom up. We were very successful, grew the company in sales and profit over $1 billion, etc. So that was a good moment in time.
And you, as I recall, brought were one of the first people to bring a sense of fashion to home goods.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's a good question. To try to take the commodity out of bed sheets, just white sheets, we started to print them, color them, and then we hired the first fashion designer, Emilio Pucci,
right,
ever to cross over from apparel design to home products design. We went further than that and hired, then we hired Bill Blass. In between, Ralph Lauren went with one of our competitors. He had come to us, but we had turned him down earlier for whatever reason. And the other thing we did, because of my arts orientation, we went to the Metropolitan Museum and signed a contract with them to access all of their fabric collection. Oh. And we would translate those designs. Some of them went all the way back hundreds of years. And we would translate those on bed sheets, bedspreads, and towels, and we would call it the Metropolitan Collection by Spring Made, and we paid them 5% off the top as royalties. And I think we paid them almost $3 million in royalties. Wow. Because they had exquisite floral bouquets that we were able to duplicate. We also did that with the Guggenheim, and then later, just to keep our foot in the arts, support of the arts, we supported a 17-year program with the Museum of Modern Art, because I felt that photography was an incoming art form. So back in the 70s, we supported a program called Photography Now by MoMA, and we gave them $250,000 a year to promote this once-a-year event. That led to our inviting, also invited Princess Grace of Monaco. She did wonderful dried flower arrangements. We translated those in the tabletop and other. So we kept a close affiliation with the arts.
Fantastic.
Matter of fact, Springs had a once-a-year art show, non-juried, where anybody in the state of North or South Carolina could submit art, sculpture, fabric. The one in the living room with the big one, Eastern Moscow, it's called. The batik hanging in the window is from one of the art shows. And then we would travel the winners of the show through the states for 1 year to expose them to So that Springs was a very interesting experience for me, and I still stay in touch with the family, see them.
A blending of commercial ideas and arts for you, and I think that's...
Pardon?
You brought together the arts.
Yes, yeah, business and the arts. I've written articles on it, and they're in some of the... I was very much a champion of business and the arts.
We should, maybe we can start talking about FIT and at the Fashion Institute of Technology.
Yeah, well, how I got...
Yeah, you started
Yeah,
here.
well, when I came east to run Springs, it was tradition, I'd say, at FIT to have on their board of trustees one or two major textile manufacturers. The head, whether it was, I think you had John Brooks of Celanese, and I think I took his place. He left the board, and I was appointed by the governor for 9 years as the textile representative on the board. And that's how I got initially involved. And in those days, the board was more passive than it is now. And Marvin Feldman, which you wouldn't remember, one of our early presidents, asked me if I would consider becoming chairman of the board. And I was uncomfortable with that idea because Goodman's father, Ed Goodman's father, had been on the board for many years, and I felt he was deserving of being chairman. So what I said to Marvin was, and also I think it was largely Jewish. I think I was the only Gentile on the board. And so I said to Marvin, I want you to contact every single member of the board independently. And if one of them disagrees with my being chairman, I will not accept. I'll only accept on you. And I said, the first one I want you to ask is Andrew Goodman, because I think he deserves it. Well, Andrew not only didn't want it, but he was very much for my having it. So apparently I got a unanimous vote and became chairman. And I remember my opening speech, I said, I'm your token Gentile. And that cracked them up. And which it was true, by the way, at that time. But I fell in love with FIT for a couple of reasons. It was highly textile oriented,
Sure.
And I was also able to bring it a home furnishings engagement, because they were always talking about fashion designers, apparel and whatnot, and home furnishing industries is bigger than the apparel industry. So I think that was useful. Matter of fact, I don't know if you remember, we used to have Home Fashions breakfast, which I started years ago to get the industry involved. And so that's how I got on the board, and I was reelected for 2 or 3 more terms, and still stay active as emeritus. I'm on 2 boards. Oh, and also started the Couture Council.
Right.
And I'm still on that board, and I'm still on the board of the foundation.
Right.
And I'm on the board. I'm on the joint committee of both of them. Matter of fact, I should have resigned 20 years ago at my advanced age then. So that I find FIT very stimulating.
You said in an earlier interview, you said that FIT reminded you of your department store experience.
Well, I guess it's interesting because I've gotten so interested in the arts in the department store and using art as a tool that when I went to FIT, it was a natural extension of what I was doing, but it was an extension, so it kept me involved. And it was during that period that Springs was doing these things with the museums and with designers and whatever. And I think a lot of that came out of my stimulation from exposure to FIT.
You first came to FIT in 1970.
Yes.
And you were working with Springs then. You were in New York. I guess you'd gone.
Well, I decided not to move to the South. Oh. And I think our friend here will understand. They wanted me to live in Fort Mill, South Carolina, and somebody said, "Tell me about Fort Mill." And I said, "It doesn't have a McDonald's." But they had a helicopter, and they used to pick me up at the Charlotte airport. We had helipads at all our plants because the helicopter, we could get around. They were all within 90 miles of each other. So, and it was a commute of an hour and 40 minutes to Charlotte, and then I was commuting that long from Princeton to New York.
Yeah, sure.
And thankfully, they did not object to my, to my living here. Then they had a guest house down there, and I would stay there for weeks at a time. It worked out very well because Bill Close, who had married the boss's daughter and was chairman, but had been faltering. That's the reason. Bill took care of Bill was very outgoing. He was a puppy dog kind of a guy. So he was doing a lot of things I would not have been able to do or even do as well. So it worked out. I had all the marketing and long-range planning and design and whatnot up here in New York anyway, at the Springs building. We owned that building.
Do you remember your impressions of the college before you came on to the board?
I didn't know anything about it.
Oh.
I learned about that it was, I was intrigued by the fact that it came out of the industrial high school, where I think they had their first classroom.
Yep.
Because they were training people for the industry, which was, I think, the largest employer in the state of New York and the state of Pennsylvania. The apparel trade.
Yes.
Yeah, 7th Avenue.
Yeah, it was quite busy then.
Yeah.
Do you remember your first impressions when you started there?
At FIT?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I think immediately almost there was kind of an electricity there. We were just moving. I remember we met with Governor Rockefeller to have the first ever baccalaureate degree program. I'm trying to remember what it was in. But there was a lot going on in terms of art, of the arts, art and design.
Right.
Business and technology was kind of a postscript, but I got very involved with that later. So I think it fit my own intellectual curiosity and particularly my interest in the arts.
Do you mind talking a little bit about some of your favorite people that you knew when at your time on the board?
Yeah, you mean from FIT necessarily?
Yeah, this is an FIT sort of focus interview. So.
Well, Andrew Goodman was, a matter of fact, the way we got Ed Goodman to be chairman was when Andrew died. I was asked to come and speak at his memorial service, and that's when I met Ed. And I immediately thought he would be a great guy to replace me. And I went after him. It took about 2 years, but we finally got him. The other board members were very eclectic. We always had to have a board member from the Board of Education. And they were generally not, they were more too politicized. This is not a negative, it's just that they were appointees of either the Board of Education or the governor. And so we got kind of an eclectic group of people. We had the wife of the state's attorney general on the board. We had Johnny Pomerantz, who's his father had this Jonathan Logan, not Jonathan Logan, Johnny's.
Leslie Fay.
Pardon?
Leslie Fay.
Yeah, Leslie Fay.
Right.
But we also had Jonathan Logan's son on the board. The father first, then the son. They were very interesting. They were 110% 7th Avenue type. And we had another woman on the board. I can't remember her name, but she was used to speak to the our students about dress, appearance, cosmetics, and so forth. She was telling the kids how they should enhance their appearance. And that was very constructive. I'm trying to think back. The union, one guy we had from the union, that we always had somebody from
Right.
the union, was, well, I won't mention him by name, but he was controversial.
Oh.
But the one who succeeded him was not, or the one who preceded him was not. All in all then, I would say the board members, because they were political appointees, were not the kind of board members you would have wished for. And that's not a negative, it's the way it was.
Right.
Today we have many more women on the board, on our boards, We have a proactive board for the museum, which we never had before. We never had a board. And they're a very eclectic group. And I think because we have more women, including the first woman president,
Right.
Joyce Brown, that we're much better off. Because what the hell, it's a school of fashion, design, art, art and design. And I think women are very sensitive to that. So I think that's, not speaking of individuals, but I would say the women as a whole. They've gone on the board, they've gone on the foundation board, gone on the museum board, have been the major reason, why FIT has advanced as rapidly as had. And I also think women are very good at maintaining the relationships we need to with the city and state.
You must have known Shirley Goodman.
Very well.
Oh.
Matter of fact, oh yes, yeah. She was excellent. And she put together a hell of a foundation board. Matter of fact, the foundation board as a group were far more proactive and more of the kind that we would wish for than our board of trustees. Because they were heads of major companies in the business and fashion designers.
Wow.
But they were in the business. And she ran it very well, and that's how we really got started with our annual dinner dance. It was a dinner dance.
That's right.
And we regularly, it was, you could count on $600,000 a year for scholarships every year from our annual dinner dance, which was run by the foundation. We just, Shirley was very good, and she was the temporarily acting president of the school for a short period. So was I.
Really?
For a very brief time, when Marvin Feldman got cancer in a pretty bad way, the board asked me if I would serve temporarily, and I agreed to serve. I lasted about 6 weeks because the head of the union said he can't serve. It's got to be approved by SUNY. Nobody from SUNY knows anything about this. And so I had to get up at what's the annual event you have that in August? Convocation?
Oh, convocation.
And say, I'm your illegal president. I want to confess. But while I was there, I fired a Monsignor who was a chaplain, and I fired somebody else. Marvin didn't have the heart to fire. It was a guy who was running our business and technology, dean of business technology. He was stealing from us, stealing computers, running a consulting firm on the side. And I remember, and the priest was hard to get hold of. He was kind of hard to get rid of. Somebody had put him on the payroll for $70,000 or $80,000 a year, and he wasn't doing anything. And I talked to him. I said, look, we can't afford you. And he said, well, I'm sticking around. I think one of the directors had pushed him on the board. So I went to the Archdiocese and talked to them. And they said, well, he's supposed to run a little parish up in New England, but he's never there. Go ahead and do whatever you want to do. So he and the other guy that I fired, the dean, they were very difficult. They wanted all kinds of packages, and I said, you know what? Here's the package that you have. You're going to go out with a decent reputation. I'm not going to say anything negative about you, the school. But if you don't do it, when you leave this office, you'll not come on campus again. You better get a lawyer, and your lawyer will be talking to our lawyer. Our lawyer is in the Department of Law of the City of New York. They will represent us. And I said, if you check how long it takes to get an answer from the Department of Law, the average is about 2 years for them to process any, because they flooded with it. And they said, so you've got 45 minutes to make up your minds. Do you want to accept our deal, or do you want to do the other? And in both cases, I was able to get them to leave.
Goodness. Well, you've seen an incredible change too, and I mean, in 47 years at the college, you've really
and in New York City.
Yeah. And in the industry as well.
Oh yeah, the industry is has migrated.
Yeah.
But it's still proactive in the sense of the design, and there is manufacturing here, but it's kind of in the shadows. It's in Brooklyn, and it's somewhere else, and it's Chinese, and it's non-union labor, and and it's when it isn't that, it's for high-end people who where price is not vital. Prices so they can afford. But it's still. You take one of our board members, who heads Lafayette 140. She's a terrific person. She does all her manufacturing in China, and she's moving into the Brooklyn.
Oh, really?
Over in Brooklyn, and that new development over there, as well as staying at 140 Lafayette Street.
This is Nanette, right?
Huh?
Nanette?
Yeah.
Lepore.
She's a terrific gal.
Yeah.
We got a lot of good directors, and they're proactive, and the women have really recharged FIT, our women board members. It's not to denigrate any of the men at all in any way, but they've just added bloom, luster, and results to a base that was very competent, but we needed the frosting on the cake.
And the foundation has also changed.
Oh yeah, dramatically, yeah. And we also now have minimums, that they have to give if they come on any of these. We never had those before.
Right.
They're substantial. If you want to be on the board, you have 15 or 20,000 a year, or whatever, depending on what the board is. Wow. And we're raising a lot more money than we did then. A lot more than the 600,000.
Yeah.
I think in the case of the museum, I think they've raised $3 or $4 million since they've been in business for us. That's all new. And they think the home fashion breakfast, when we ran those, raised about $1.3 million. Mm-hmm. Then we had a $10 million scholarship fund, which Ed and I were co-chair of, and that was independently. And then Baker walks in and hands us $10 million.
That's right, I remember.
Unsolicited. That kind of thing.
How about the institution itself, the students, the curriculum? How do you?
I think that, and this is looking from the outside in, I think it's, it's still politicized, but not, it's politicized in a charitable kind of a way, and it's balkanized in a charitable kind of a way. And I don't think it would be a good idea to have it all one way. Let me give you a couple of 4 examples. We have department heads who are very aggressive. The one that handles fashion design, he's very well regarded in the industry, and the departments have a very close relationship with industry because they send the students in for, for the summer programs, etc., get them, find them jobs. On the other hand, if you got a department running out soliciting either funds or events from their constituency, then FIT wants to honor people from their constituency. Sometimes you get, you get clash there. The other times you get clashes where the deans or the department heads are hugging their business to themselves and they're not sharing. They're not sharing what they know and what they have and what they could do. Where on a joint basis they would probably be better off if there's more exchange among the students as well, so that they get a cross-fertilization of these departments. So I see that as an issue, but not a serious problem. We have that same problem with the alumni trying to act independently in the school, and they're going after the same people, and that's it's a bone of contention, but I don't know of any schools that don't have that problem. I think there's still bureaucracy in the schools, and I think it has to do with management styles, and I think that we can't get too hung up with one style being better than the other. Some is very autocratic, some is very democratic, some is very much letting the people down below run things. I'd say management from the bottom up instead of the top down. But I think what they've done well, I think they manage that pretty well, these kinds of issues. I wouldn't call them problems, they're issues. On the other hand, I think there's been a significantly higher degree of conscientiousness and sensitivity to what I just described. I also think one of FIT's great strength is, and I attribute that to Joyce Brown, her emphasis on long-range planning. She's been, and also in handling the union. I feel that she's done a much better job. Marvin used to say, you know, whatever you want. Okay, you got it. I remember interviewing for a president. He was from Boston. The guy was from Boston, and I was chair of the committee. There were 20 of us on the, and Marvin, not Marvin, but the head of the union, our union, who now deceased, was sitting at the table, and the prospective president of FIT said, "By the way, I looked at your union contract. There's nothing else to give away," which was true. I mean, they'd gotten everything they could possibly get. And Joyce inherited that.
Yeah.
And she was tarred and feathered when she first came in by the union, but she had a wonderful response to them. She didn't say anything. She wouldn't answer. And there's nothing more frustrating than somebody, yeah, and you say, you just sit there. So she took a lot of abuse from them, but her attitude was, yeah, I'll give you something, but I want something in return. You know, it's got to be a kind of a two-way street. And I think that's all water over the dam now. They're doing much better, those kind of relationships. And even with the alumni, they're sorting out those kinds of problems. And they're inevitable in an institution like that.
Right.
Particularly a creative institution where everybody wants to have their own little shell of creativity. But then that's an outsider's, point of view. I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be a lot wrong, partially.
No, it sounds like, from my experience of being there for 17 years, what you've just said pretty much characterizes the institution and some of the problems that they face. Pete, who do you think has had the greatest influence on you in your life?
That's what?
Had the most influence on you, the most positive influence on you?
What? Who did you say? Who had it?
Who has had the most positive?
Well, I've been fortunate in that I don't think there's any one person that has. I think one of the reasons I've been able to progress is because I've had mentors all my life. The first one was Stephen Gerard, deceased.
Right.
And there was a Dr. James D. White in there who salvaged me when they tried to kick me out, and I became a friend of his for the rest of my life. He was a major influence on salvaging me. He said he would be responsible for me, and I stayed. We became friends. I stayed friends. That was one, and a bookkeeper in the Albert M. Greenfield Company who kind of took me under his wing. James E. Robeson, who was president, and Roy Little, Roy was president of Textron, but Jim was president of Indian Head, that textile company. And I think what he taught me and others was integrity. He was the emphasis on being honest. No weaseling, no welching, straightforward honesty, and he pounded that into us. And the other one was the one who ran the ad. I told you that ad that prompted getting in was Charles O. Wood, and he's the father of Charlie Osgood, who's on the Sunday morning show.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I worked for him for 17 years at Indian Head. He was a huge mentor to me. And then the president of Federated Department Store, Paul Sticht, was a mentor. So I was learning all the time from people much smarter and more mature than I was. I was very fortunate to have them as mentors. At FIT, I relate very well. I related well to all the presidents, and except one, what we had from Boston, but who didn't last very long.
Right.
And they brought a guy in who was temporary, who was good. But But I'm trying to think of who else might be in that category. Certainly Trump was not. I found a picture of Trump at the UN ballroom, year 2000. FIT Alumni Award was going to a friend of his. And there's a picture of Joyce and me, and Joyce and her husband flanking Trump and the other guy. I sent it to Joyce recently.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Is there a question you wish I had asked you today that I didn't ask?
No, I think one thing I think that ran through everything all my life, and I still have heavy emphasis, is the importance of integrity. I think if you go online, you'll see that, and look up integrity, you'll see me quoted in there 15 or 20 years ago. Integrity is not a 90% thing, it's not a 95% thing. You either have it or you don't. And I judge people by that criteria first. And if I had kind of like the 5 I's: integrity, intelligence, intestine, intellectual curiosity, as kind of guidelines when I talk with people about hiring them, but integrity above all.
Yes, I saw that quote about you. When I did Google you, and I saw that quote.
And I think I've exhausted. Unless you have.
I think that's it. Are we good?
It's lovely.
We're good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Pete.